Well, hello and welcome to a replacement video for a class that would have taken place on January the 4th. We actually did meet for this class, myself and one other student, but since it was just that one other student and since he was dealing with some things going on with his medication and feeling tired, and I always kind of feel tired at a normal class time because it takes place kind of late at night for me. We mutually decided after waiting for people for a little while to show up to go ahead and call off class, and I said I would just go ahead and make a recording. In looking over the material that we have for the remainder of 2 Samuel, there was a slight possibility. I never know how discussions are going to go, but there was a slight possibility that we could have actually like wrapped up the whole thing in one class. But I was always kind of feeling like it was going to be something like 1.5 classes. And so my aim for this video is to kind of let this be the half class and preserve a major topic of a discussion for next time. There's basically, when you think about what's going to happen in the book from this point forward, there's basically kind of like 4 big things that happen. I mean, this chapter that we're about to examine in 2 Samuel 9 is big, but it won't take that long to discuss. And so, well, I said that there's big things. I don't want to undersell anything in the book, but no, really what's going to happen here in the book is you have the sin of David and Bathsheba. You have the rape of Tamar. You have Absalom's rebellion, and then you have David's census. And so that's the kind of the major historical events moving forward in this book. And so Absalom's rebellion takes up like a big chunk of material, and I'd rather talk about that as one kind of whole conversation. And of course, I always love having you guys to answer my discussion questions rather than as what you're going to see here. This is in this video, me answering my own questions. But so again, we're going to try just to do a little bit in this video, and then we're going to pick up and hopefully, Lord willing, finish the book next time. So let's jump right in, having explained all of that, to 2 Samuel chapter 9 and David and Mephibosheth. All right, so we left off with kind of a pretty mundane chapter at the close of our class last week, 2 Samuel chapter 8. As mundane as it was, it speaks to the stability of David's government and what he had done up until this point. And so David had been prospering as he had been following God's path and pattern for a godly king. And chapter 8, again, like I said, speaks to stability. When you see lists of things that, God's people beat and how God's people organize themselves, you know that things are going pretty well. We saw that back in the book of Joshua. We see it here. And so, yeah, like I said, even though it's a fairly mundane chapter, there is something being communicated by it. And so in this kind of, if you want to call it a zenith or a high point of David's reign, when you come to 2 Samuel 9, it's almost as though David is sitting on the mountaintop and he's asking a really good question that I wish more people would ask. Who can I invite to come up with me? There's a song that calls us to think about when we reach the heights of life, to think about how in the valley there is someone who needs you. I don't know if you've sang that song before, and I can't remember all the lyrics, so I won't butcher it. But just that thought of, again, you being in a place where things are going well for you, it's good to look out and see who you can bless, who you can help. And so one of these things where David decides that he's going to bless and help someone goes well. One of these things we're going to find out when David decides to help and bless someone doesn't go well. All right, but let's talk about first the one that goes well in the case of Mephibosheth. So if you remember from earlier in our study, Mephibosheth is the one living relative of Saul up until this point. And I believe we've talked about briefly, I'm having glimmers of having talked about this briefly, so forgive me if we haven't, but how this is like Jonathan's a son, and they kind of, the nursemaid runs away with him and drops him, and then he breaks his feet, and then he's lame. And so there's this really sad kind of conclusion to the house of Saul with its remaining member. Well, David is at a point, like I said, where he wants to invite people up to the mountaintop, so to speak, of things going well. And so he finds out that Mephibosheth is alive, and that there remains someone of the house of Saul, and he looks to bless. And so to go ahead again and walk through what we see in the text, David asks if there's anyone left alive from the house of Saul to whom he could show kindness. And he learns from one of Saul's servants named Ziba about the existence of one of Jonathan's sons called Mephibosheth. And so the text points out again in verse number 3 that there is still a son of Jonathan who is lame in his feet. And so we find out again about him and about this sad detail. We're reminded of this sad detail again. So David fetches Mephibosheth and offers him a seat at the king's table, which is a pretty big deal. We've talked before about how it's customary in these times, not necessarily in David's court, but customary in the whether we're talking about the period of Joshua or the Judges, or now period of the kings of Israel, in Gentile courts typically, and even probably sometimes amongst God's people, though I don't know, it always tells us who and when. You would have in your court the defeated kings of other nations, and they wouldn't be getting meals and being fed, as guests at your table necessarily. They were there more to intimidate the people who were coming to seek something from you, or maybe even discuss something with you, or something like that, ambassadors and so on. But this is David, instead of that kind of thing, doing kind of like the opposite kind of thing, where he's inviting someone from really the vanquished kingdom from before him to come and sit at his table as a guest, inviting him to a place of honor and a place of privilege. And so, again, he finds Mephibosheth, allows him to, sit at the king's table, and then he orders Ziba and his family to take care of this man. And so it says in verse number 9, the king called Ziba, Saul's servant, said to him, "I've given to your master's son all that belonged to Saul and to his house. You therefore and your sons and your servants shall work the land for him, and you shall bring in the harvest, that your master's son may have food to eat. But Mephibosheth, your master's son, shall eat bread at my table." And so he's providing for his family and for his well-being and his wealth. And so in placing at in his disposal, this man Ziba, 15 sons and 20 servants that Ziba himself had, it says in verse number 10. And so Ziba at this point says that he's going to obey. And then again, Mephibosheth is invited to David's table. Everything happens as David commanded in verses 12 and 13. And we're reminded yet again in verse number 13 that he was lame in both his feet. Now, why is that pointed out twice? It's a picture of, again, David's graciousness. And it's also a beautiful picture for us as students of the New Testament to kind of pause and think about. Mephibosheth really is a picture of God's grace and what God does for us. When you think about what it is to be a New Testament Christian, every Sunday we are invited to the King's table. You ever paused and thought about it that way? We call it the Lord's Supper. So who does it belong to? Sometimes we can think it's really our supper in memorial of him. But when we think about it properly, no, it's his supper. It's his celebration of his graciousness towards us. It is not we who have invited Jesus to our table. It is we who have been invited to his table. And spiritually speaking, if we were to think about what right or ability we have to be here, we would be like lame-footed Mephibosheth. We, spiritually speaking, have no right to be at the king's table, no power, no strength, nothing under our command or in our control. And yet we've been invited to this beautiful place of privilege. I think that it serves as a wonderful illustration. This chapter serves as a wonderful illustration of God's grace and what, again, God does through Jesus. And so, again, next time you gather around the Lord's table on Sunday, think about how you have been invited to the King's table. Let's go, though, to 2 Samuel chapter 10, as, again, David is looking to seek to bless others, and here we get something that doesn't go so well. So the title of this chapter that I've given is David defeats the Ammonites and the Syrians. That's not really how it began. It didn't set up as something that was going to be a battle for him to win. So David learns that the Ammonites have a new king named Hanun, and David sends servants to see how he can assist this new king because of Hanun's father, Nahash. Now, in verses 1 and 2, we find he wants to do that. We find simply in verse number 2 that this, it says here that Nahash showed kindness to me. David says he showed kindness to me. Now, what this kindness is, what Nahash did for David, we don't have a record of that. It's probably while he was on the run from Saul. So sometime in his wanderings in the wilderness, we know that he had been well treated by the Philistine king, but maybe in those raids and things that he was doing, or maybe at some other time, he was in some way looked after by Nahash. We know he had various times and spent amongst Gentile kings and kingdoms during that time when he was on the run. So again, anyway, regardless of where he how he had been helped, he wants to again invite people to the mountaintop, bless and help others. Well, the Ammonites don't take kindly to being helped, I guess. They probably, Hanun is probably, suffering from, the kind of thing that we see Rehoboam suffering from, later on in biblical history. He is trying to make a name for himself and prove he's a big, tough guy, and takes some bad advice here, perhaps, or even operates under his own bad advice, but in any event, instead of receiving these messengers as with the goodwill they were intended, with which they were sent. It says here, Hanun took David's servants, shaved off half of their beards, cut off their garments in the middle at their buttocks, and sent them away. I can almost imagine one of our class participants, a certain young man, laughing at this particular account. I kind of get a chuckle out of it too. It's not great, not nice, shouldn't do that to people, and yet the whole thing is intended to be, comical and shaming. And yet, this really isn't funny when you think about the people who are involved, right? And so I'm thankful that David has graciousness toward these men. And he says to them, they're greatly ashamed. It says in verse number 5, he says, wait at Jericho until your beards have grown and then return. How the times have changed. I know beards are more in fashion today. I'm certainly not an exception with my beard, but we went through a long period of modern history where really to have a beard was more of a shameful thing, and back then, obviously, to not have a beard was a shameful thing. But anyway, seeing sensing David's anger, the Ammonites, I say, or keen sense of smell. It says in verse 6, and the New King James takes an interpretive look at this word and says, made themselves repulsive. Usually the versions that do a little bit more of a little literal translation there have something about David being odious or smelling bad, so. Or rather, they smell bad to David. I should say that properly. And so they smell bad to David. And so they sense, David doesn't like us now, and they hire mercenaries and prepare for war. And so rather than apologize, or say we didn't do the right thing here, they just prepare for war. And so that again is Hanun's take on all of this, instead of which is contrasted obviously with his father Nahash. So David responds to this by sending out his entire army. They found themselves caught between, at this point, though, unfortunately, the Ammonites and the Syrians. So the Syrians are taking advantage of this movement and hoping to gain an upper hand over the Israelites. Take a step aside, the Syrians are going to be a major player in Israelite history from this point forward, and are continually going to pose problems for particularly the northern kingdom. But again, they're sensing the opportunity to do something here, and so David's army finds itself in sort of this pincer situation where they're being squeezed. Well, Joab decides to lead the best soldiers against the Syrian mercenaries, and then to send the rest with Abishai against the Ammonites. They are to assist each other if the enemy advances on either side. So that's the plan: divide and conquer, effectively. Well, in doing this, the Syrians run away. And when the Ammonites see that they run away, they retreat to their city. And Joab, he goes back to Jerusalem, more or less successful. So the Syrian king orders his troops, though, back over the Jordan River to rejoin the main force. David learns where the Syrian troops have gathered, orders his army to march against them, and they defeat them too. And so Syria is kind of forced into making peace with David, and feared to help the children of Ammon anymore. And so that's, kind of will be status quo under David's reign. But like we said, Syria is going to be a problem for future Israelite kings, and again, mostly dealing with those of the northern kingdom once the tribes divide during the reign of Rehoboam. So you're reading this text, and I want to go ahead and point this out because it will help us a little bit when we get into chapter 11 and 12. The Bible is beginning to make heavy use here of something that happens throughout the Old Testament, and something that will certainly be at play in the text going forward, of this language of, David did. And so the armies were fighting against David, and David killed, and but David, as you read the text, he's like not even there. And so really, when you read this, understand it to be against David's army, and David's army killed. And the biblical principle that this speaks to, or at least my little kind of catchy saying that helps me to follow this communication, what one does through another, one does. And if I've mentioned that before, forgive me, but I'll say it again, that biblically speaking, if I send someone on a mission, I am going on the mission. If I order someone to do something, it is as though I have done it. And so if they do wrong under my orders, depending upon what it is, they might also be responsible, but I am responsible. And so that's important to understand, especially when you get into the account of David and Bathsheba, because you're going to be, you probably know the account, but, David is blamed for the murder of Uriah. If you don't know the account, I'm sorry for spoiling the story for you, but you should know it. David is accused for murdering Uriah. He doesn't wield a sword at all in that, but the circumstances are created and crafted by him, and so he's the one responsible. And this is true not just of David and this text, but it's true of the behavior of God. When you think about God delivering his law on Mount Sinai, you're like, well, God directly does that. But then you go to Galatians chapter 3, and it says that the law was given through angelic mediators. And you're like, oh, okay, so that's how it worked. God sent the angels to give the law to Moses, but because what one does through another, one does, God did it, right? And so the text can say that, but then go on to clarify elsewhere, oh, there was actually a little bit more to it, right? So it's a helpful principle in Bible study, and so I hope you'll remember it. What one does through another, one does. But let's go on to, again, this tragic set of circumstances that we have just alluded to, the sins of David and Bathsheba, and and as we're going to point out, the murder of Uriah. 2 Samuel chapter 11. So contrary to his custom, David stays in Jerusalem as Joab leads his army into battle. The text points out that it happened in the spring of the year, at the time when kings go to battle, that David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel. So the kings were going to battle. David sent Joab, though, the text says. David remained at Jerusalem, and in verse number 2, it happened one evening that David arose from his bed, walked on the roof of the king's house, and from the roof he saw a woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful to behold. Now, there's a let me save that discussion for just a second. So I know I have a discussion question coming up, so let's pause there. But I get the consequence of all of this. And so in verses 3 through 5, David finds out who she is, and even after learning she is married, the two have an affair. Bathsheba gets pregnant, and so adultery leads to pregnancy. Now, let's ask the question: what led to sin in this account? So, first of all, the text is very careful to point out that the kings went to battle, and David did not. So when we want to avoid sexual sin, or really any sin, the best way to avoid sin is to be busy doing the right thing. When we think about, fleeing, there's that language in the New Testament, like flee sexual immorality, flee youthful lust. When we think about fleeing only works if there's something that you're running to. And that's why whenever you think about fleeing from the standpoint of the New Testament, I want you to think also about pursuing. Pursue godliness, pursue righteousness, pursue good things, or else you're just running and you're just as likely to run from one bad thing to another, or you're just as likely to stand still and do nothing. And even though it's not a biblical phrase, it's certainly something that's borne out biblically that idle hands are the devil's workshop. The devil loves it when people are not busy doing something. And that's really the problem here. It's not that David is doing anything wrong when you think about him not going out to battle, because it's his prerogative, obviously, to not go out to battle, to decide to send troops instead of going himself. And there may have been compelling reasons for him to do so. But the first reason, again, is that he doesn't have anything meaningful, it seems, for him to do at this time. He sends others to do what he normally would have done. And then, as a consequence, the reason I know that this is, not a wise decision in this particular case is because you see him being restless. I mean, when you have something that you could be doing and you're not doing anything, then the likely outcome is what you're going to see in verse number 2. What you see in verse number 2, rather, it's restlessness. David can't sleep. And so he wasn't active when he could have been. He didn't fill the void of meaningful activity with anything else meaningful. And so he was idle and restless. And so that kind of sets him up for the temptation. Now, Bathsheba, let's think a little bit about her. It's ever, growing in popularity that really we don't want to blame the victim in the account. And I think that modern takes on the account of David and Bathsheba would see Bathsheba as the victim here. She is the one who is without power in this society, merely responding to the wishes of one who is in power. There may be some credence to that, and if you were to attribute the greater guilt in this case, I would say the greater guilt does go to David. It's important to recognize that when the prophet goes to deliver God's message, he goes to David. He doesn't go to Bathsheba. Still, though, the consequences of behavior are certainly dealt out on Bathsheba. The child that she is bearing at this time in our reading here, we're going to find out later that child passes away, and so she's affected by this, and seemingly joins David in being punished for this. When I think about this text, as much as I want to be sensitive to modern sentimentalities, you have to question, obviously, what she's doing here to a degree. Was it customary or common for people to bathe on top of their rooftop? Perhaps. But could that have been done in a more discreet way so as to not invite attention? Also, perhaps, it's something worth considering. I don't know that we need to fully embrace the modern kind of, well, it's not so much that I shouldn't be showing, it's really more that he shouldn't be looking. Yeah, he shouldn't be looking, but maybe also I shouldn't be showing, and that can go both ways. I know that typically we attribute kind of the lust of the eyes to the male of the species. It's not just for the male of the species. I know that while not every woman or every man for that matter struggles with lusting in the eyes or looking at people lustfully, it doesn't mean that you can just cast a blanket over everyone or over an entire gender and say that no one struggles with this. And then so again, men likewise should be more discreet with what they wear and know that they could have a negative influence on women, just like women could have a negative influence on men. And so as I kind of unravel all of this, I see some biblical pointings towards modesty, towards but then more importantly in the case of David, towards meaningful activity, and then further towards just knowing when a door is closed. The problem is that when he finds out that this woman is married, and not just married, because this is Uriah the Hittite. Now, I don't know if I have this popping up here or not, but it'll come up later. Uriah the Hittite is one of David's like really important soldiers, one of the one of the, in David's tiered armor, military, he's not one of the top three in his military, but he's one of the top 30. And an important man. And as we're going to see in the rest of this text, an incredibly loyal man. So even though, a Hittite, maybe a proselyte, perhaps, so someone though that's incredibly loyal to David and not worthy of this kind of treatment. So that really should have closed the door right there. No matter what Bathsheba was showing, no matter what David should have been doing, when he finds it out, that should have been the end of the conversation. So to further examine what led to sin, was an elevated sense of self. The pride of life so often goes with the lust of the eyes, and David used the power that he had within his disposal to get what he wanted. So again, I don't know, like Bathsheba, we don't get her perspective in all of this. Like, did she feel like she had to respond to the king's wishes? I find it interesting that, that again, we just don't find any kind of her trying to avoid, reject, any of that. And so again, while I don't want to place all the blame upon her, I don't think the text allows us to walk away thinking that she's totally innocent either. And so David, again, perhaps bearing more blame, but both being guilty. And there are multiple things that could have been changed or avoided to see this all play out differently. But sadly, it doesn't play out differently. And so what are we going to do about it? Well, David's temptation is to cover it up. So he devises a plan to cover up the sin. He brings Uriah home on leave from the battle, hoping that he's going to spend some time with his wife. The hope is, and he even tells him, like David says to Uriah, go down to your house and wash your feet, take your shoes off and spend a little while. And he's expecting, no doubt with Bathsheba also being aware of this plan, for there to be a sexual union between husband and wife that's going to cover up, whose child this is. And that'll be that. Well, unfortunately, Uriah doesn't go home. He's too loyal, too focused on the war. Maybe if you remember our study of 1 Samuel and the account of David and the showbread, maybe there's something here also about when going to battle, we don't want to engage in sexual relations, and maybe there's something to that. I don't know, but at the very least, just following how the text reads, Uriah says in verse 11, the ark and Israel and Judah are dwelling in tents, and my lord Joab and the servants of my lord are encamped in the open fields. Do you want me to go home? I won't go home. I'm going to. You can order me to take some rest from the battle, but I'm not going to go home when no one else gets to go home. And so, too loyal, too focused on the war. Well, David commands him to stay another day, and actually, gets him drunk, hoping in a drunken state he would go home. And still though, Uriah does not go home. He is an incredibly loyal man, and even when his senses are dulled by alcohol, it doesn't change, that part of his nature. Uriah, again, as I've said, I was going to, I thought this was popping up later, but Uriah, again, was one of the 30. He was one of the mighty men of David, a special warrior class that existed amongst David's military, and therefore a leader and a good soldier. So David sent away Uriah then with a letter that for all practical purposes ordered his death. He was to be placed at a hot point in the battle, and as they're fighting, everybody is ordered to make a retreat without sounding a retreat, effectively leaving Uriah to face the army alone. And David's been in enough battles to know that if placed in such a set of circumstances, even the most valiant of soldiers is likely to fall. And so that's the plan. Well, Joab, gets the orders, follows the orders, sends news back of Uriah's death, and so that's kind of that. after the mourning period is over, David orders Bathsheba to come to his house. And so instead of looking like the adulterous man who, killed Uriah, which are the real, the real truth of the matter, he appears to be a kind-hearted man who shows um, kindness to this departed man by looking after his widow and what probably people are thinking at this point, the widow's unborn, or rather the man's unborn child that the widow is carrying. So text says, though, in close verse 27, but the thing that David had done displeased the Lord. So what is the Lord going to do? Well, David is not past hearing at this point, though there is a certain hardness of heart that had set in that led him to do what he had done, and multiple mistakes that led to, or not necessarily mistakes, but multiple displays of a lack of wisdom, and then also mistakes that led to him do what he had done. Nathan knows that God knows that he can touch his heart through Nathan, and so Nathan comes and teaches a parable, and through that parable, the Lord rebukes David. So Nathan tells a story to David about a rich man who had many sheep and who chose, in spite of having many sheep, to take and eat a poor man's sheep rather than to eat one of his own. Now, to kind of, set up this in verse number 3, it says the poor man had nothing except one little ewe lamb. So it's not just a man who has much taking from a man who has few. It's a man who has much taking from a man who has one, and who didn't just have this lamb, but it was like a pet to the family. It grew up together with him and his children, and ate of his own food, drank of his own cup, and lay in his bosom, and was like a daughter to him. And so all of that, is very touching, even as it was. But, if you didn't know the backstory of David and you only knew that he was a king, you might not anticipate the reaction that Nathan gets to his parable. David gets very angry and orders a very harsh penalty to be dealt to this rich man. He says in verse number 5, as the Lord lives, the man who has done this will surely die. And not only will he die, but he's going to restore fourfold. His estate is going to have to pay times 4 for the lamb because he did this thing and because he had no pity. All right, so why does David respond this way? You probably know the answer if you've been following along in this study, and that is that David used to be a shepherd. So before David was anointed by the prophet Samuel, long before, therefore, he had become king, he was a shepherd in the field of his father Jesse. And so he knew sheep, and he knew the relationship between a shepherd and sheep, and he knew, the details of the story. He may well have had a neighbor who was like this, a man that he knew had only one sheep. That's altogether possible. And so there's a lot of heartstrings that are tied into this story for David. It speaks very strongly to his past. So that's why David responds this way. But why did Nathan tell this story rather than addressing the problem head on is another question worthy of consideration. This is something for us to think about when we think about parables and why they're used here and why they're used in the New Testament. So, when Jesus explains his own use of parables in Matthew 13, he says that it's because of people's, lack of spiritual sight and lack of spiritual hearing. He says that, the people of his generation, their eyes were closed, their ears were hard of hearing, and their hearts were not receptive. And so when you want to get people to accept something that otherwise they're probably not going to hear, you take another thing that will touch them and you kind of throw it alongside of the thing that you're actually wanting them to learn or understand. And so a parable, the meaning of the word parable, you have para, which is you recognize parallel, right? Like parallel lines. And so para is the Greek preposition for like alongside of or next to. And then bole, parabole is from the verb balo, just to like, it sounds like the thing that is thrown, like a ball, but no, it means to throw. And so a parabole is a thing that's thrown next to or alongside of. And so the the thing that you know they're going to accept is thrown alongside of effectively the thing that you want them to learn or understand. And so Jesus would do this to get people to agree to something without realizing they'd agreed to it, or understand something without realizing they understood it. And the same thing happens here in this parable. So Nathan says that to David, "You are the man," not positively. We say that something. No, you are the man. You're the man who's done this. You're the man who has perpetrated this crime with what you did against Bathsheba. Now, there's some interesting things that are said to David at this point. To David, in verse number 7, it says, "I anointed you." This is what the Lord God says through the prophet Nathan. "I anointed you king over Israel. I delivered you from the hand of Saul. I gave you your master's house and your master's wives into your keeping, and gave you the house of Israel and Judah. And if that had been too little, I would have given you much more." Now, the first thing that's a little bit puzzling about this is, how did God give David his master's wives when Saul evidently, surprisingly perhaps, only had one wife? 1 Samuel chapter 14 and verse number 50, it says the name of Saul's wife was Ahinoam, the daughter of Ahimaaz. And so, as far as we know, that's the only wife that he has. For all of Saul's faults as a king, the multiplication of wives doesn't seem to be one of them. And so, how does that work? Well, there's various solutions that perhaps are proposed to this whole thought of David getting his master's wives and so on. Maybe, though, the suggestion put forth by Keel and Delitzsch is, on point here. They translate this or understand it as this: "I handed over the whole nation to thee as king, so that thou couldst have chosen young virgins and wives from all the daughters of Judah and Israel." And so, everything was given to you is basically what's being said there. Saul perhaps had opportunity to marry others, but now David has opportunity to marry others. And that naturally leads to the question, God would give David more wives. It's not really what he wants David to do, but it speaks to that larger problem that we have throughout the Old Testament of trying to reconcile polygamy with God's teaching on marriage. Certainly the teaching on marriage is there. Certainly polygamy is a long-standing practice. Certainly we have case after case after case in biblical history of how it doesn't work and how it's not a good thing. And so I can only look at this from the scope of, like Acts chapter 17, the times of this ignorance God looked over, and God was willing to tolerate certain things, culturally speaking, that he intended to rectify once people understood him better through the person of Jesus Christ. And that's why when Jesus comes, he doesn't follow Moses' teaching or the rabbi's teaching in Matthew 19, but rather he says, let's go back to the beginning and consider how God made them at the beginning and how God made marriage at the beginning. So whatever, is to be understood here, know that we as Christians obviously live under something different today. All right. So another question, though, to be asked apart from those, questions about marriage and polygamy: how did David kill Uriah the Hittite with a sword? Well, remember, we just talked about this. What one does through another, one does. And so, no, David did not kill Uriah the Hittite with the sword, as verse 9 reads, in a literal sense, but again, by setting up the circumstances, by ordering them into being. He is the one responsible, and he is the one whom the Lord holds guilty. So again, what one does through another, one does. All right. Well, David prophesies that can't be right. Nathan prophesies that let's change. I hate it when something like that happens. Nathan prophesies that evil is going to come against his house because of this. Someone is even going to do to David what David did to Uriah. We don't know how all this is going to bear out at this particular point, but that will be borne out very soon. And sadly, so it says, this is going to be perpetrated by a neighbor. Neighbor doesn't necessarily, biblically speaking, have to mean someone who is of no relation. For those of you who know where the story goes, we'll talk more about that later, nonetheless. But anyway, before the Son, in verse 12, it says, "For you did it secretly, but I will do this thing before all Israel, before the sun," is the New King James reading, in broad daylight. That's basically what that means, as the New American Standard reads. Well, David responds very contritely to this, confesses his sin. By implication, he repents of it, and the Lord forgives him. But just because a person is forgiven doesn't mean the consequences come to a halt. Sometimes we mistake that. God has, we just alluded to Jesus' teaching on marriage, divorce, and remarriage, and that's a very hard teaching. I recognize that, but for all of its hardness, realize that just because someone repents doesn't mean the consequences come to an end. I think the modern church really needs to grasp that fact, and being forgiven and seeing consequences come to an end are two entirely different things. So it is in this account. The consequence is going to be that the child that Bathsheba carries is going to die. Well, David doesn't just take that. We know that at times when faced with the consequences of certain sins, there can be a change in the will of the Lord on the part based upon how a person has responded. Now, typically, when the Lord will change his will as deals with consequences is when repentance hasn't taken place. In this case, repentance has taken place. And so though David fasts and though he prays, that doesn't change anything about the situation. David learns on the seventh day of his fasting and his praying that his child has died. I can't think, of any more tragic outcome from all of this, to know that Uriah dies, the child dies. It's hard, when you read things like this, and there's so many things like this in the Old Testament, like, why did the child have to suffer? And I don't know that it's any consolation when we think about other situations, like when a couple who hasn't committed any sin, for example, it's not just consolation to be like, well, the child's in a better place, but that's true. What I'm saying is the very things that will eventually console someone aren't necessarily the things that we need to tell them at that moment. I think that what a parent needs to hear when a parent loses a child is that we love you, the hurt that you feel is real, and we're here for you. Don't feel like you need to suppress or hide this. I hate the way, just as an aside to this particular point, I hate the way that for so long people have dealt with pregnancy and with miscarriage, and it's like you don't want to tell people that you're pregnant too early because what if you lose the baby? Well, if you lose the baby, you're going to be heartbroken, and all the more should the church lovingly surround you and be kind to you. But the reason that people kind of don't do that, they don't reveal these kind of things, is because they hate the way that people aren't good comforters. And so the solution really isn't to not tell people. The solution is to teach people to be better encouragers and comforters. But I will say that though there's something said here about the child's fate and how David processes all of this, and there's something encouraging here, I will say that this isn't necessarily something that arises from an outside party, and it does need to be contrasted with something else. So let me go ahead and bring up the quote here, or how David processes all of this. To the surprise of everyone, David ends his fast upon hearing this news. He even goes and worships at the tabernacle, and this is how he's now processed it. He fasted, hoping the child would recover, but now the child is dead. He can only hope to go to him. And so this is the beautiful thing about a miscarriage. This is the beautiful thing about a child that dies. In verse 23, now he is dead. Why should I fast? Can I bring him back again? I shall go to him, but he shall not return to me. So that's the beautiful reality surrounding a child who dies. Now, how we embellish that reality, sometimes unfortunately embellish that reality, is we we say things like, well, the child will never know the pain and suffering of this world. Please don't embellish that, and really maybe don't even let you be the one who says this to the person who's lost a child, because though that person might arrive at this conclusion like David did, you can't drag them to it. And then when you embellish it by saying something like that, what you're really doing is you're kind of invalidating the whole parental exercise. You're saying, well, really, we shouldn't have kids because the world's a terrible place. No, the world represents a beautiful opportunity to, life represents a beautiful opportunity to come to know God. And it is always better for someone to have that opportunity than to not have that opportunity. And so, yes, the child is safe, but the child goes to eternity without really knowing who God is. And the blessing, of course, with our God is that that child is going to have eternity to find it out. But there's something special about coming in this life to know who God is and having our souls prepared for an eternity with him. So we need to see, instead of seeing reality as a curse, we need to see it as a blessing and an opportunity. Instead of seeing life as a bad thing, we need to see life as a good thing. I think it's too much of that kind of embellishment that is seen, as we've talked about in previous classes, this generation that's coming up turning away, even in the church, turning away from having children because, oh, I don't want to bring my child into this world. Well, sin has always been a problem and always will be a problem until the world comes to an end. And yet God says in the scriptures that having children is a good thing. Blessed is the man who has his quiver, of arrows, so to speak, or his quiver of children, full of children, full of arrows, so as arrows in the hand of a mighty man, so are children, and so again, all right, we're saying a lot there, but hopefully you can get some benefit from that. Let's move forward. Why did the child of David and Bathsheba suffer when they were the ones who had sinned? Good question. And, again, we've answered it to a degree, but we'll say a little bit more here that the fact is that sin, the consequences of sin are always more widely felt than the sin itself. And yes, there are people outside of sin that are affected by sin. This child is not dying because of his sin or because his existence is sinful. The child is dying because David and Bathsheba have sinned. And the implication, obviously, is that if Bathsheba had continued in marriage to Uriah and had been pregnant some other way, or not some other way, but the only way, with Uriah, that this would not have been the consequence that she faced. Well, David and Bathsheba have another son, though, after this, called Solomon. And the child is also called Jedediah, which literally means beloved of God. And so, again, in spite of these this inauspicious beginning, David and Bathsheba are certainly, brought together, are allowed to be as husband and wife. And to pause and ask the question, why does David get to keep Bathsheba? Given that this union began in adultery, well, as Romans 7:1-4 teaches, when a spouse dies, the marriage ends. And so, though adultery was how this relationship began, the relationship can continue with repentance and be a legitimate marriage again at a time when God allowed polygamy, or at least seemingly did so. All right, so the capture of Rabbah. We'll probably cover this, and maybe let's check my clock here. Forgive me for having to do this. Yeah, we'll go ahead and talk about this, and then kind of wrap up, I think, for this kind of abbreviated video here. But anyway, the capture of Rabbah. So Joab sends news that the Israelites are making progress in their battle against the Ammonites, and that David should come so that glory can be his. Evidently, this is the conclusion to chapter 11 and verse 1. And so we're getting kind of the end of that discussion here. David does come, the Israelites do win. David wears the crown of the Ammonite king and punishes the people of the Ammonites. Now, it says, as it reads here in verse 31, that the people are, kind of forced into labor. We kind of have a situation like we had with the Gibeonites in the book of Joshua kind of play out. The Ammonites are made kind of slave labor. So if you compare the reading here in 2 Samuel chapter 12, verse 31 with 1 Chronicles chapter 20 and verse 3, you're going to see a little bit of variance here. The King James, American Standard, New American Standard, and the Septuagint all have, instead of David, putting them to work with saws, it actually has him sawing them with saws. And there is some debate therefore, as to whether the Ammonites were executed or put to labor. And so that gets softened if you're reading the ESV or the New King James. In 1 Chronicles 20, verse 3, they don't have the sawing business at all. They make it read something like you're reading 2 Samuel. So there's some question as to whether, which way the text is meant to be read there. So I thought I'd point that out. Not that it's a really, really big issue. What kind of, though, does, come to mind as I think about this text is, why is this account here? I know it's the natural conclusion of the war in 2 Samuel 11:1, but do you notice something different about the way this plays out? Well, Joab is a good military leader, but he has proven himself to be disobedient, headstrong, and even wicked at times. When David is kind of coming to power, you remember that you remember that Joab kills Abner, Saul's general, even after Abner has kind of defected and come over to David's side. And as David is kind of processing all of this, he says this about Joab in chapter 3 and verse 39. And I am weak today, though anointed king, and these men, the sons of Zeruiah, are too harsh for me. The Lord shall repay the evildoer according to his wickedness. So that's pretty strong words to be saying about Joab. He doesn't punish Joab himself, but he does kind of give Joab the strongest of rebukes. When you think about the Lord rebuke you kind of thing there. So even though, as chapter 8 says, Joab is a military leader still and head of David's army, there's a different language that surrounds prior readings. Before the sin of David and Bathsheba, and even up into the death of Uriah, it was always David sending Joab. David sent Joab. David sent Joab. Or David sent to Joab and told him, do this, do this, do this. But here, do you notice how the text reads a little bit differently? Instead of David sent Joab and ordered Joab to do this and that, now it says Joab fought, and he is the one who's giving the orders. So he sends messengers to David and says, I have fought against Rabbah. I've taken the city's water supply. Now, therefore, you gather the rest of the people and take it. And so, granted, Joab has good, motivations in this, lest I take the city and it be called after my name. But David is pictured as being the passive one in all of this, and he is the one who is obeying Joab. Now, keep that in mind for what we're going to see play out in the future here. I think that rather than talking about Amnon and Tamar here, we're going to go ahead and save all of that discussion for the larger discussion that we're going to have with David and Absalom. And then, so that's our three big goals for next time. We're going to talk about Amnon and Tamar. We're going to talk about Absalom, and we're going to talk about the census, the numbering of the people. Hopefully we'll have time to do all that, and hopefully I haven't done too little in this video, and hope that you've been profited by our study together. Let's go ahead and close out with a word of prayer. Most holy God, we thank you, Father, for the blessing of being able to reflect upon this text, and we thank you for what you've taught us through the sin of David and Bathsheba. We pray, Father, that you will please help us to reflect upon what went wrong, and reflect upon what happened in repentance, and reflect upon all that we can gather from this text. We pray that as we think about even the little details, that you will help us to be better comforters towards those who have lost children, to draw what we can from this text, but not to lose sight of how we can best help others. And again, though we've studied a lot that's very sad in these few chapters, we're thankful for what we saw earlier in David, how he wanted to invite people up to the mountaintop of his success, and how he extended that gracious offer to Mephibosheth. And as we think about that, we think about the beautiful invitation that you have given us, not to suffer because we have sinned, not to get the due that we deserve, but rather to be forgiven and to be invited to your table. And though there are consequences in David and Bathsheba's sin, we're so thankful that we see your grace also on display in this, and how David was allowed to continue and move forward. But Father, help us to move forward in a different way than he did. And please help us as we continue to reflect upon and learn from this text. We offer this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. So we will continue, Lord willing, next time. And thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you soon. All right. If you have any questions over anything we talked about today, please do not hesitate to ask, and God bless you.